The blizzard hammered down across the Wyoming Territory, burying the narrow dirt roads that snaked through Granite Valley under feet of drifting snow. The wind howled through the pines, snapping branches like dry twigs, and the few scattered homesteads that dotted the valley sat dark and silent against the white onslaught. Their inhabitants huddled inside, feeding wood stoves and praying the roof beams would hold under the weight of the snow. Most folks had bolted their doors hours ago. The saloon in the nearby town of Silver Creek had emptied before sundown. It was the kind of winter night where survival meant staying put, keeping warm, and conserving heat. Out here, that was the only law that mattered. But Henry Cole had never been good at ignoring a feeling in his gut. He stood at the frosted window of his small, weathered cabin, a mug of black coffee cooling in his calloused hands, watching the white oak consume the land he had fought so hard to tame. The cabin wasn't much, rough-hewn logs, a stone fireplace that drafted when the wind came from the north, and memories of a wife who had passed 2 winters ago. Now, it was just Henry and the silence. He was 40, though the harsh frontier life had etched deep lines into his face, making him look older. He wore a heavy wool shirt and trousers tucked into boots that had seen better days. He should have been in bed, burying himself under quilts to sleep through the freeze. But his gaze was fixed on the tree line. That was when he saw it. A flash of red, stark and impossible against the endless white. At first, he thought it was a trick of the lantern light reflecting on the glass, or perhaps a dying fox. But the spot of red moved, stumbled, and fell. Henry didn't think. He set down his coffee, threw his heavy sheepskin coat over his shoulders, and grabbed the storm lantern from the hook by the door. The cold hit him like a physical blow the moment he stepped outside, the wind stealing the breath from his lungs. The snow was knee-deep and climbing, sucking at his boots as he trudged toward the tree line, shielding the lantern's flame with his body. "Hello," he shouted, his voice swallowed instantly by the roaring wind. He reached the spot where he'd seen the color. There, half buried in a drift, was a small figure curled into a tight ball. It was a child, no older than 6. She was wearing a red silk coat, padded and embroidered with gold thread, now stained with ice and mud. It was fine clothing, entirely unsuited for a Wyoming blizzard. Henry dropped to his knees, scooping the child up. She was dangerously light, her skin pale as the snow, her lips a terrifying shade of blue. She didn't move. "I've got you," Henry grunted, fighting the wind to stand. "I've got you." He carried her back to the cabin, kicking the door shut behind him and latching it against the storm. He laid her on the rug before the hearth, stripping off his wet coat and immediately building the fire up until it roared. The girl was unconscious. Henry worked with gentle, frantic efficiency. He removed her frozen boots and the sodden silk coat, wrapping her in his thickest wool blankets. He rubbed her small hands and feet, trying to coax warmth back into her veins. She was Chinese, her dark hair cut in a straight fringe across her forehead. Henry knew there were railroad camps to the south, but that was miles away, and no Labor's child wore silk like this. "Come on," he whispered, chafing her arms. "Wake up, little one." It took an hour before her eyelids fluttered. When she opened them, her dark eyes were wide with terror. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rough logs of the wall, pulling the blanket tight like a shield. "Easy," Henry said softly, raising his hands. "You're safe. No hurt. You understand." She stared at him, trembling violently. He didn't know if she spoke English, so he moved slowly, ladling out a bowl of broth from the pot that always hung over the fire. He placed it on the floor and slid it toward her, then retreated to his rocking chair to give her space. The girl looked at the bowl, then at Henry. Hunger won out over fear. She crawled forward and drank the broth with desperate gulps. When she finished, she didn't retreat quite as far. "Name?" Henry asked gently, tapping his own chest. "Henry." The girl watched him. She reached into the pocket of her inner tunic and pulled out a small object, clutching it tight. It was a pendant of green jade, carved into the shape of a dragon. She held it out, not to give it to him, but as if it explained everything. "Barber," she whispered, her voice raspy. "Find Barber." "Barber," Henry repeated. Father. She nodded vigorously. Then she pulled a folded, damp piece of thick paper from the same pocket. Henry took it carefully. It was a letter of transit, stamped with official seals in both English and Chinese characters. The name at the bottom was one Henry recognized, a name that was whispered in saloons and banks across the territory with a mix of awe and fear. Li Wei. Henry's blood ran cold. Li Wei was not just a merchant, he was a tycoon who effectively owned the new rail line pushing through the mountains. He was a man who commanded armies of workers and had the ear of senators. And this freezing, terrified girl was his daughter. Your barber is Li Wei? Henry asked. Li Mai, she said, pointing to herself. Mai. Henry looked at the window. The storm was raging harder than ever. If Li Wei was searching for her, he wouldn't stop for weather. But if the girl wasn't returned immediately, or if the wrong people found her, it could mean war. Okay, Mai, Henry said, his voice steady. We wait for the sun. Then, we find Barber. Mai seemed to understand the tone, if not the words. She curled up on the rug, exhaustion taking her. Henry didn't sleep. He sat with his rifle across his lap, watching the fire and the door, listening to the wind scream. The morning broke with a blinding brilliance, the sun reflecting off feet of fresh snow. The air was still and biting. Henry saddled his horse, wrapping Mai in layers of wool and his own sheepskin coat until only her eyes were visible. We're going to town, he told her as he lifted her into the saddle in front of him. Silver Creek. Someone there will know where the rail camp is. The ride was slow, the horse struggling through the deep drifts. Mai clung to Henry's arm, her small body tense. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking Silver Creek, the town looked peaceful, smoke rising from chimneys in vertical columns. But Henry knew Silver Creek. It was a town built on hard labor and harder prejudices. They rode down the main street, drawing stares immediately. A rancher riding with a Chinese child was not a sight seen every day. Henry ignored them and headed straight for the general store, which also served as the post and telegraph office. Thaddeus Thorne, the owner, was the closest thing the town had to a mayor, though he held no official title. Henry tied the horse and lifted Mai down. She gripped his hand tightly as they walked inside. The bell above the door jingled. Thaddeus Thorne was behind the counter, weighing flour. He was a portly man with a flushed face and eyes that always seemed to be calculating what he could take from you. Beside the wood stove stood Sheriff Grady, a thin, sour-faced man who enforced the law only when it suited him. The conversation in the store stopped dead when Henry and Mai entered. Henry, Thorne said, his voice lacking warmth. Didn't expect to see you dug out till noon. And? What is that? This is a lost child, Henry said, his voice loud enough to fill the room. Found her in the storm last night. She belongs to Li Wei, over at the rail expansion. Thorne scoffed, wiping his hands on his apron. Li Wei? The dragging tycoon? What would his kid be doing wandering around your shack? Got separated from a caravan, I reckon, Henry said. She has papers. I need you to send a rider or a wire to the main camp. Let them know she's safe. Sheriff Grady stepped forward, hitching his gun belt. He looked at Mai with open disgust. We don't cater to strays here, Henry. Especially not that kind. Mai shrank behind Henry's leg. She's a child, Grady, Henry snapped. And her father is the most powerful man in the territory. You want to explain to him why you refused to help his daughter. Thorne laughed, a dry, rattling sound. I think you've been out in the cold too long, Henry. You think Li Wei is going to believe a dirt-poor rancher found his precious heir? More likely, you snatched her from a camp to ransom her back. The accusation hung heavy in the air. That's insane, Henry said, his grip on Mai's hand tightening. Look at the papers. He reached into his pocket to produce the transit letter. I don't need to read heathen scribbles, Thorne spat. Get her out of my store. You're sparing the decent customers. I'm not leaving until we get word to her father, Henry said, planting his feet. You're leaving because I said so, Sheriff Grady growled, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Take the girl and ride on, Henry. Dump her back where you found her for all I care. But she don't stay in Silver Creek. Henry looked around the room. A few other locals were watching, their faces hard and unyielding. There was no sympathy here. Just the cold, ugly reality of the frontier. You're making a mistake, Henry said, his voice low. A big one. The only mistake is you bringing trouble to my door, Thorne said. Now get out, or Grady locks you up for disturbing the peace. Henry looked down at Mai. She was trembling again. He couldn't fight the whole town, not with her in the line of fire. Fine, Henry said. But when her father comes, don't say I didn't warn you. He turned and walked out, the sheriff following them to the porch to ensure they left. Henry lifted Mai back onto the horse. Where go? Mai asked, her voice small. Back to the cabin, Henry said, mounting up. We'll wait there. If they won't send word, we'll build a signal fire big enough for the whole valley to see. He rode out of town, feeling the sheriff's eyes on his back. He didn't know that the signal fire wouldn't be necessary. He didn't know that Li Wei's trackers had already found the trail of a lone horse in the snow. Night fell early in the winter. Henry and Mai were back in the cabin, the fire crackling. They had shared a meal of beans and cornbread. Mai had warmed up, showing Henry how to make shadow puppets on the wall with her hands. For a moment, the danger felt far away. Then, the ground began to vibrate. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic, thundering pound that grew louder by the second. Henry stood up, reaching for his rifle. Stay here, he ordered Mai. He walked to the window. What he saw made his breath catch. Dozens of torches burned in the darkness, surrounding his cabin in a wide semicircle. The light glinted off the metal of rifles and the polished buckles of saddles. There were at least 30 men out there. Henry Cole. A voice called out. It wasn't the sheriff. It was a voice of absolute command, accented but perfect in its diction. Step outside. Henry checked the load in his rifle, then leaned it against the wall. If they wanted him dead, he'd be dead already. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, his hands visible. The scene was intimidating. In the center of the riders, on a magnificent black stallion, sat a man in a long fur coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was sharp, intelligent, and currently masked with a terrifying calmness. Flanking him were men who looked like hard-bitten mercenaries, and Chinese enforcers armed with repeaters. I am Li Wei, the man said. You have something of mine. Henry nodded slowly. I do. She's inside. Warm and fed. Li Wei's expression flickered, a crack in the stone. Bring her out. Henry turned to the open door. Mai. Baba is here. A small cry came from inside, and then Mai was running. She flew past Henry, barefoot in the snow, launching herself off the porch. Li Wei was off his horse before she hit the ground, catching her and burying his face in her neck. The silence that followed was heavy. The riders watched, their weapons lowered but ready. Li Wei held his daughter for a long time, listening to her rapid-fire Mandarin as she pointed at Henry, then pantomimed the cold, the fire, and the soup. Finally, Li Wei stood, lifting Mai onto his saddle. He turned to Henry, walking up the porch steps until he stood eye to eye with the rancher. She tells me you found her in the drifts, Li Wei said. That you carried her, gave her your own blanket, and fed her before yourself. She's a child, Henry said simply. It's what you do. It is what you did, Li Wei corrected. My men tracked her to the town. They say you were there. I tried to get help, Henry said, a bitter edge entering his voice. I wanted to send a wire to you. The storekeeper and the sheriff. They had other ideas. Li Wei's eyes narrowed. They refused. They threatened to arrest me if I didn't dump her back in the snow, Henry said. They didn't believe she was yours, and they didn't care if she froze. Li Wei's face hardened into something that looked like carved granite. He turned to his head enforcer. Captain Chen. Take 10 men. Escort my daughter back to the private car at the railhead. The rest of you. Ride with me. Ride where? Henry asked. To Silver Creek, Li Wei said softly. I wish to speak with this sheriff and storekeeper. He paused, looking back at Henry. Ride with us, Mr. Cole. I think you should see this. The town of Silver Creek was asleep when the thunder returned. This time, it wasn't a lone rancher. It was an invasion. Li Wei's riders flooded the main street, their torches turning the night into day. Men kicked open the doors of the general store and the sheriff's office. Thaddeus Thorne was dragged out in his nightshirt, sputtering and indignant. Sheriff Grady was pulled from his cot, his gun belt stripped from him before he could reach it. They were thrown into the muddy snow in the center of the street. Townspeople peered fearfully from their windows, watching the army that had occupied their town. Li Wei remained on his horse, looking down at the two shivering men. Henry sat on his horse beside the tycoon, watching the tables turn with a grim satisfaction. Who are you? Sheriff Grady stammered, looking at the wall of armed men. What is the meaning of this? I am the man whose daughter you condemned to die, Li Wei said. His voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the street. I am Li Wei. Thorne's face went white. Mr. Wei. We didn't know. Mr. Cole told you, Li Wei said, gesturing to Henry. He showed you her papers. He begged for a telegraph. And you told him to throw her back into the blizzard. We thought he was lying. Thorne cried. We were just being cautious. Cautious, Li Wei repeated. He looked at the town. I am building the railroad that will feed this territory. My money pays for the goods in your store. My trains will carry your cattle. I thought I was bringing progress to this valley. But I see I was mistaken. He leaned forward in his saddle. From this moment, the Iron Dragon line will not stop in Silver Creek. There will be no depot. No mail drop. No supply offloading. My tracks will bypass this town by 10 miles to the east. A gasp went through the onlookers. That was a death sentence for a frontier town. Without the train, Silver Creek would wither and die within a year. You can't do that. Thorne shrieked. It will ruin us. You tried to ruin my family, Li Wei said coldly. You showed me your character. Now, I show you the cost of it. He looked at Sheriff Grady. And as for you, I will be speaking to the governor about who wears a badge in this county. I suspect your tenure is over. Li Wei turned his horse, dismissing them as if they were nothing more than slush underfoot. He looked at Henry. Mr. Cole. A word. He led Henry slightly away from the groveling men. I cannot thank you enough for the life of my daughter, Li Wei said, his voice regaining its warmth. Money seems insufficient, though you will be compensated. I don't need money, Henry said. I just wanted her safe. I know, Li Wei said. That is why you are a good man in a bad place. But I will not leave a debt unpaid. He pulled a heavy leather pouch from his saddle bag and pressed it into Henry's hand. Use this. Not for yourself, if you are too proud, but for this valley. Build something better than this. He gestured contemptuously at the town. 6 months later, the snow had melted, and the wildflowers were blooming in the Granite Valley. Henry Cole stood on the porch of his cabin, but it wasn't just a cabin anymore. The logs had been resealed, a new barn raised, and the herd in the pasture had tripled, all high-quality stock. But the real change was down the road, halfway between Henry's ranch and the dying town of Silver Creek. Using the gold Li Wei had given him, Henry had built a large, sturdy timber structure. It wasn't a saloon or a store. The sign above the door read the Valley Community Hall and Clinic. He had hired a doctor from the East who didn't care where his patients came from, and a schoolteacher who believed every child deserved to read. It was a place where no one was turned away, not the ranchers, not the rail workers, not the drifters. A buggy pulled up the drive. Henry smiled as he saw Mai, now wearing a bright blue dress, sitting next to her father. They visited once a month when Li Wei inspected the line. Mai jumped down and ran to Henry, hugging him around the waist. "Mr. Henry," she beamed. "Look! I learned English words." "I hear you, Mai," Henry laughed, patting her head. "You sound wonderful." Li Wei stepped down, shaking Henry's hand. He looked toward the community hall in the distance, bustling with activity. "You built a good thing, Henry," Li Wei said. "We built it," Henry corrected. "Sometimes, you just have to remind people that we're all just trying to survive the storm." Li Wei nodded, looking at the peace that had finally come to the valley. The town of Silver Creek was fading, but the community around Henry Cole was thriving, built not on fear, but on the simple memory of a lantern in the dark and a door that opened when it mattered most.